All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's session. I'm Jess, I'm the VP of Marketing here at Quorum. If this is your first time joining us for a Quorum webinar, Quorum is software used by public affairs professionals to map, track, change, and report on their policy landscape. Joining the Quorum team today, we have Nick from the Public Affairs Council. The Council has been our team's go-to education resource, and Nick especially has been a huge resource to our team, to me, to our customers. So we're really excited to have you here today, Nick, to teach us all how to create a social issue engagement playbook. Before I hand it over to Nick to introduce himself, a few logistical things. Feel free to use the Q&A tools to ask a question, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. You're also more than welcome to use the chat box to contribute to the conversation. We will send out the recording afterwards for anyone who wants to revisit this content, and that's it. So Nick, I'll let you take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the invite. I know this has been a topic that a lot of folks have been talking about. Unless you've been kind of living in a hole for the last couple of years, companies, associations, industry groups, advocacy groups have all been asked to kind of engage more around social and political issues. And sometimes it goes over really well. Sometimes it's gone wrong. And so we've been working on this issue for a while. We've been doing polling on this issue. Some of that is public polling that I'll talk about actually today. Other groups have done it, like Edelman, Morning Consult. We actually work with Morning Consult on some of the polling. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the insights we've learned from working with our member companies and associations who have been dealing with this issue directly. And basically kind of we've interviewed them, we've talked with them, and we've created a social issue engagement guide. And I'll be going across that today. The full guide is also available if you're a council member, but the majority of it is here. A little bit about myself, if you don't know anything about me. My three focus areas at the council are digital and grassroots advocacy, crisis and policy communications, and stakeholder engagement. Previously, I worked at the American Dental Association, which is a member of the Public Affairs Council. That's how I learned about them. And I've also worked on the Hill and for several state legislators. So what does the council do, in case you don't know? I know you guys know what Quorum does, but we are the trade association for public affairs professionals. So Quorum's a member, as well as other consultants and vendors in the space. But the majority of our members are companies. 40% of the council is actually, or almost 50% rather, are companies. So we have over 400 member companies. They range from like Microsoft and Amazon to smaller companies that are in highly regulated spaces. We also have associations and advocacy groups and really fun organizations like the Minnesota Vikings. None of our members would agree on any public policy issues. We usually have all of our companies are actively policy foes, actually. But what they do agree on is they can come and improve kind of how they do their everyday job. They can come and learn from our executive education offerings. We do over 100 events a year. They can learn from our expertise, so they ask us member questions, and they can learn from others in their community. And so our constant kind of effort is pushing the profession forward, training folks, and our focus is completely on best practices. What are the newest strategies, tactics that you can deploy in a range of public affairs functions, whether that's government relations or CSR and DEI or grassroots advocacy or digital communications, all which kind of fall under the purview usually of public affairs. Like I talked about our members, there's just some a sampling of the 700 plus members that we have. So why is this so important? Now to the meat today, hopefully. Like I said, social issues, political battles, controversies, they're all here to stay. They're not going anywhere. Our nation is more, especially in the US, is more divided, but even globally, we've seen a rise of populism. We've seen a rise of government actors who have a negative viewpoint on business and industry, generally speaking. And so this is really important that we need to understand that companies, associations, advocacy organizations are going to constantly be pulled into political and social battles. And I'll talk a little bit about the data behind that shows that's the case. Lastly, government affairs, public affairs, CSR, DEI, corporate comms, they're all kind of converging and they're playing a real leading role here. And so one of the things that I've been noticing is kind of the rise of the chief impact officer especially at companies. We're seeing these folks kind of converge and saying, actually, it's not just a government affairs thing. We have all these other stakeholders, which are really important to us. And we've always had these kind of in separate functions, but they're kind of converging. And one area they're specifically converging around are these social issues. Next, obviously, if your company can affect your stock price or your ability to work in markets, it can also damage the reputation of your industry if you're an association. These issues are also controversial for a reason. They're social issues that are being debated in the public for a reason. It's because there's people on both sides of the issue. And so companies who obviously, in associations that want to kind of sell a product and want to just deliver their services, are trying to navigate in a highly partisan environment where they expect, especially some consumers, their companies, the people that they engage with on a day-to-day basis, to have a stance on these issues. And I'm going to kind of give you some data first before I give you the playbook. And the first thing that I want to mention, data-wise, is it's not just about speaking out. If I was going to give you a playbook on just about how to make a statement, A, that would be a much quicker webinar, and B, it wouldn't cover nearly the range of options that your organization has. And it's not going to suffice anymore. So it's not just about, did my company make a pledge to address racism, which on the right side is not necessarily seen by all consumers as very sincere, but it's actually, did my company take steps to prevent racism? If that is the question, you have much more higher levels of favorability there, right? And there's obviously going to always be some skeptical people about that. But when we talk about these issues, we need to think about, it's not, the only other option is not just, issuing a pledge or signing on to a statement. There's a lot of things that government affairs practitioners, people in the public affairs department can be doing to address some of these issues. And I'm going to talk about those different levels of engagement as we get towards the end. The other thing is, I think people are often surprised that, their company or the organization that they work for actually has a say on these issues and that they're believable. But employer media is the most trusted media. And this is from the Edelman Trust Barometer. This is not from the Public Affairs Council anymore. But this is a great, I don't know if anyone's read the Edelman Trust Barometer this year, but they have a lot of new questions in it about the pandemic and about companies engaging on these types of things. And I think it's really important to realize that while, yes, you may sell a certain widget or provide a certain product or service, that your actual employees are also listening to you. And what we found a lot of times, but it was not necessarily the customers that were asking the company to address an issue. It was the internal employees that were saying, what is our stance on this? What are we doing to change this? How are we contributing to solving this problem? And you guys as an employer are very trusted there. The next thing is that businesses are often expected to fill the void left by government. We saw that increase dramatically under the last administration, where a lot of people felt that there was, huge issues ongoing in the United States that were not being addressed by government. I'll be very curious to see if this changes in the future, of companies actually feeling a little less pressure because now there's a different administration in place. But a lot of folks felt that CEOs should step in and fix a problem when the government can't. They should take the lead, and then they should hold themselves accountable, to the public and not just the stockholders and the board. And these are big changes that we've seen. And so we've seen a lot of business-oriented groups like Business Roundtable actually come out and say that we're moving from stockholder and just general capitalism under that framework, moving more towards stakeholder capitalism, where your employees, the members of the public, the people that are working in advocacy and NGOs should also have a say in how you're doing business and what you're actually contributing to society. And then lastly, I want to talk about this because this speaks to the divide. There is still a divide about what CEOs, companies, and organizations should do on political and social issues. And so this is not easy. However, the generational gap does really exist. Meaning that there's a large portion of folks, especially when the baby boomers set, that think that companies really shouldn't be getting involved or speaking out on non-business issues. But when we look at millennials, we look at Gen Z, and then we look at adults overall, it actually shows in favor for, especially when the business is directly tied to the issue, that they should play an active role in addressing it. So again, this is not a slam dunk, dunk case for our company needs to change itself from being, this company that is focused on obviously shareholder price and those types of things and stakeholders to, let's just change ourselves to be a B Corp and be, sustainability, ability corporation. That's not necessarily the case for most organizations, and that's not what the public necessarily wants. The public really wants is when these issues are directly tied to the business, when your organization has a clear effect on what's going on in society or politically, that they do get involved there. And we're going to talk about, there's probably another social issue, another political issue that comes up every week. And so if your organization's engaging in all of them, it is going to be incredibly difficult to just continue regular business operations. And I'm not suggesting that. And that's part of the reason why this is so difficult, is that each scenario is a little bit different. And there's constantly new ones that are coming. And so we decided to kind of help create this guide so that you can help kind of decide which issues you're going to participate in, and then the level of participation you want to participate at. And lastly, one of the people that I'm going to quote on this a lot is Salesforce. I think they've done a really good job about this. And they've been open about it. And so that's why I want to talk about it. A lot of these other companies have been doing it. They haven't necessarily been very open, but it's just talking about how, the business community is really about improving the state of the world now and not just about making money. And Salesforce has really been living up to that recently. So now into creating a social issues management process. The first suggestion that we came across from all of our members and things that we've been talking about for a long time is actually creating a social issues team. Having a team at the company that is made up of 12 to 15 members. It could be a little bit smaller if you're a smaller company, but that are from diverse backgrounds, experienced business functions. And I was actually reading articles in preparation for this, and I've given this talk a couple of times to some companies after we produced the guide, because they were looking to create something like that we suggested. But I was listening to articles specifically about CEOs, and they were talking about how they've kind of created these informal kitchen cabinets, these kind of groups that they deemed as like truth tellers from across different sections of the company, and that they've been relying on. A lot of organizations, companies now have employees resource groups. Companies, in my mind, should be compensating their employees for that time. They should get credit for it. LinkedIn does that. I know other companies do that as well. This is similar to kind of an employee resource group in that aspect, especially if you're putting people that are not from the organizations I'm going to talk about, but folks that are in the CSR and DEI realm, that are in HR, legal, corporate communications, government affairs, investor relations, and other key business functions should really be included. Especially if they're not from kind of the corporate communications and government affairs or CSR and DEI space, they should be compensated for this because it's not necessarily directly tied to their day-to-day job. The team can include someone like a CEO, but it doesn't necessarily need to. It can include someone that has the ability, though, to make that decision at the end of the day. It should include the ultimate decision maker, if possible. And that's really helpful so that the task force kind of feels empowered and that it's not just kind of blindly talking about these issues. And the last thing is they need to meet regularly. This is something I'm going to talk about, what they might be discussing and how you might create these meetings when you do them. But it's not something that you're necessarily going to be good at the first round. We've seen a lot of companies kind of stumble on this, and it's the companies that haven't really potentially had to flex their social issues muscle, their crisis response muscle, a lot of times, to know really where their stakeholders stand, to really understand where their employees are, to really understand the difference between just a couple of kind of enraged customers that are tweeting about every single company versus a real sustained effort that's pushing this company to make a stance. And so the more that you take in this data, the more that you do this, the better at really taking in all of the kind of information and the better decision makers you will become on these teams. But if you're not ever doing this, if you're leaving these decisions up to potentially just one person, I do think that increases the chances of you making the wrong decision at the wrong time or making the wrong statement at the wrong time. And that has happened a lot. And so I think this group does need to meet regularly, and then especially be able to meet when an issue comes up dramatically or very quickly. First, when you do this, you have to establish a guideline and principles to what your company is going to engage around. You cannot engage around every issue. So there needs to be some guidelines there. And then as issues come in, you want to start asking the same sort of questions for each issue so that you, again, can start benchmarking and collecting data and having a more systemized response and assessment to each of these social issues. And that you're not necessarily making a very, it's not that I'm saying that you need to be dispassionate about these issues. Obviously, a lot of these social issues affect your life. They affect potentially your employees' lives. But it's also helpful to understand the larger kind of implications around these, right? Because there are so many different stakeholders to consider. And so having a formalized process will help make sure that kind of all the voices are heard. And yeah, in a lot of cases, there's going to be some voices that are a lot more important than others. And so the first thing is, does this issue have an importance to the company? Does it really impact your company and its key stakeholders? And that's one of the first things. You cannot be engaging on every single political and social controversy that comes up. But when it starts to impact your company and your stakeholders, then it should be on the radar. Next, are we making commitments already around this issue? Are we already involved in climate change? Have we already engaged around this? And so if an issue related to the climate or energy comes up, we've probably already made statements or commitments around this. What have we said in the past, and what is our track record on this, right? Especially if you're an organization that has a history about doing these types of things, that needs to be, the culture of your company really needs to be true to itself. Again, if your products or your practices tie into it, or if there's a direct correlation to this issue, that is really important to know. And sometimes folks don't even realize that their company is involved maybe in a certain country and has certain business practices there, and so until a social issue or political issue comes up in that country. Allies and adversaries, again, that needs to be kind of taken into account into these meetings. Who would want us to take action? Who would oppose our response? I get this question a lot. If we come out on this issue, if we start to make a statement, if we start to engage on this issue and maybe lobby on it, we're going to have opposition, and this really important opposition. Maybe it's the governor in the state that we operate in the most or have our headquarters in. That all needs to be considered. Another one is honestly, your competitors, the peer companies. What are they doing? Are you going to be the first in? Are you going to be the last in? This is one of the hardest things, and this is where you want your communications person and your digital people involved, is what's the intensity of media interest? What's the tone and trajectory and extent of the coverage? This is one of the hardest things to get right. And this is why I think you need to really rely on the communications folks here who day in, day out deal with story arcs and understand how quickly a story can pick up and change course, and how much media interest really is on this topic. Sometimes CEOs who come from a very business-oriented background don't realize this, and don't realize that the story is not going, is either going to last for weeks or is going to go away in one day. They don't know the difference between those two stories. It's to really understand, to understand that. Potentially, a lot of times, sometimes the media are the only ones that are talking about this. Sometimes there's a small story out there that it's just 2 or 3 reporters that are kind of poking your head and trying to see if they can create some interest in the public, and the public really doesn't care about that. That's also important to know. Obviously public opinion, and so there's tons of polling that you can get from a lot of organizations. I mentioned Morning Consult already in some of their data that I showed you, but there are a lot of other companies that do daily polls, kind of pulse polling online that are incredible at getting you this information, and a lot cheaper than traditional public polling where they're calling you up and you get results like you get 100 people. You can do a 1,000 person poll for much cheaper nowadays. And then what's the proximity of the issue? Is it occurring in your state or where you have facilities? So again, that's kind of the first level that you would do about any issue. The next level is actually looking in at all of those stakeholders. So what are the employees saying? What are the customers saying? What are the policymakers saying about this issue? Does this issue directly affect employees or families? A lot of companies didn't say anything about some of the gun issues that were going on in America until it started affecting their employees or their families. And I think that's really important to think about, right, as an organization, and say like, okay, this actually is hitting home. You know, before we didn't feel the need to talk about guns. Our company doesn't have any, you know, we don't create guns or we don't sell guns. Why should we come out on this? Well, actually, it's happening in our community, and it's affecting our families. That makes the issue much more salient to your organization. Not saying that every company should come out on gun violence. I'm just saying that these are some of the things that would potentially make a company do that where you wouldn't necessarily see it before. How engaged are employees on this issue and where do they stand? Is there a silent group of employees who may resent our company's position? I think that is really impactful to start thinking about who's not reaching out to us on this issue. You know, what's our company's perceived bias? Are we a tech company that is perceived as very left of center? And is there maybe a minority of employees, potentially a large group of employees that feel that we shouldn't talk out on this, but they're afraid to speak out? I've heard of companies having, you know, secret Slack channels and secret, you know, communicating via, you know, online message boards and Signal and all sorts of apps, because they're afraid that if they come out with a position that goes against the majority or the perceived majority of their company. That's really important to know, right? Even if it does not affect your overall decision, this is all information that I think is really important to discuss as a team. Do our customers have strong feelings on the issue? Where do they stand? Do our customers expect us to lead on this issue? And is our brand being damaged by not acting? And will our brand be damaged if we do act? Sometimes by not acting, your company is the kind of what I always call like the zebra on the end. There is so much safety in numbers with a lot of these issues. So 500 companies make a statement, sign on, start committing resources, join an association over an issue, or leave an association over an issue, is much more impactful than if one company does it, right? And you're much safer from getting bad press, from getting pushback from advocacy groups, from getting pushback from customers, if you're in line with what corporate America is doing. And then next is are policymakers particularly divisive, or is this issue particularly divisive? Will policymakers speak out against your company's position? And then will involvement in this issue create new political alliances? Sometimes when a company kind of engages around this, they find out that there's actually some lawmakers that support them, increasingly, and so that want to actually, come out and support your efforts. Same thing with advocacy and groups and investors. Are there any advocacy groups working on this issue that already have credibility with our stakeholders? And should we be reaching out with them? Should we be talking and engaging with them? Especially if there are issues that are going to be central to your company, you need to start working with those advocacy groups, those NGOs now. If you know that civil rights is going to be an issue for your company, that your company is going to care about for a long time, but you do not know the person at the NAACP, or you don't know the person at the ACLU, or all these other civil rights groups that exist out there, and you don't have those contacts, when an issue comes up at your company and you might be in a controversy, they're not going to be able to come out and speak on your behalf. They're not going to be able to issue a statement and say, they know this company is working on these issues and they have been for a while. And they've been donating to our groups and they've been active in our committees and in our task force. That's really important to be thinking about. Are advocacy groups talking about our company to the media? Are they the ones that are creating some of this media interests? Do they expect us to take a position? And are there certain low risk kind of partnership opportunities with certain groups where, there's like an easy button out there that there's a group that is doing great work. And I'm going to pitch one of those groups to folks on here, but the Civic Alliance does a lot of great work on voting rights issues. And they are completely nonpartisan, and their entire goal is to increase voter participation. They were just formed in the last couple of years, so they don't have a political or partisan history, and it's only companies that can be a part of it. There were a lot of organizations that said, we do get out the vote efforts, we do all these things, but not a lot of folks know about it. Let me, I don't have all the resources. I'm only one government affairs staffer, and I'm trying to do, a grassroots program. I'm trying to do a PAC program, and I also now have to get out the vote. I don't have all these resources. And they look to Civic Alliance to help them with that. It's a very easy, low risk partnership opportunity there. Investors what are they saying about these issues? Could there be a resolution that comes out over it? Are they willing to kind of compromise on it as well? So
Nick, Jorge had an interesting question that he posed, which maybe you'll get to here, but which is sort of about rank ordering your stakeholders and how you go about making decisions there. So in this case, the question was, sometimes your brand may be damaged with your employees by not acting, but the same is not true with your customers and the public. So how do you go about making decisions there?
Yeah, and also if I knew the answers to all of this, I'd probably have my own consultancy and been living, on a beach somewhere by now, because obviously it's cost some companies billions of dollars in a single day when they've made the wrong decision around this. And I think that is part of our justification for creating such an extensive process, is that we know that these are difficult issues. I would say from the conversations, and I'm talking about hundreds of conversations over the last 3 years that myself, Doug Pinkham, our CEO at the council, Kristen, several other team members have been talking with companies. The most kind of aggressive stakeholder in the last couple of years has been employees around these social issues. And that's not necessarily always the case. I would say it does definitely geared towards companies in the tech space, but it's kind of coming to a lot of companies across the board. It's coming to companies that are, you would think their employee base is more conservative, but that there's a really active group of employees there. I think it's really hard to put employees second or last at any company nowadays, especially when we have, I don't know, 11 million open jobs and things like that, or something ridiculous like that in the United States. It's a very competitive environment. And employees have the ability to really affect how successful your company is on a day-to-day basis. And so I would say this, it can be hopefully mediated by the level of engagement. And so, which is actually next. I think a lot of folks think that because we decided to engage around an issue, because we've once decided that it's like, all or nothing. And that's not the case. There's several levels of engagement that we've kind of put together, kind of archetypes around to help people in that process. I will also say so we decided on supporter, partner, and champion. Doesn't matter what you call them. I'm going to go through what those areas kind of detail, but it is really important to be thinking about, we cannot be a champion on every single issue. And sometimes it's okay to just be a supporter on an issue, or it's okay just to be a partner on an issue, because we only have this one group that really cares about it, because it's not, very tied to our business, because we don't actually have the ability to make an impact on it sometimes. If your company is smaller and you're dealing with a huge social issue, you can try to be a champion on it, but you might not have a lot of impact there. So maybe there's a smaller issue where you can be the champion on, where you can be impactful on, and it makes sense to put your efforts and your resources there. So I'm going to go through each of these. The supporter, again, you don't, once you made a decision, sometimes your decision is to just continue to kind of collect data. That's okay. But once you've made a decision to actually come to a conclusion about it and decide to engage around this issue, that's when you're going to look for what's the level of engagement we're going to do. And so it could be the supporter, which would be maybe you're convening an internal committee, you're soliciting employee support, maybe you're going to poll other stakeholders. You might coordinate with corporate peers again, because you want to show that you have support for this issue, but that you're necessarily not a leader or champion around it. You might continue to monitor and prioritize this issue. And then you might be, updating stakeholders. In general, usually the end output is that you are just making a general statement about this issue and company values. Not necessarily, you're showing your support, you're not essentially committing resources around this topic. The next one is a partner. This is where you might engage more employee resource groups. You might hold a town hall meeting on this topic. You might join other companies' policy statement or coalition on this issue, or commit to it, supporting allied groups. This is maybe when you bring in those advocacy groups and say, we're going to support you in your efforts to address this situation. You might make sure that your internal policies are in alignment with the position. So that might mean changing your internal policies. You can't talk about potentially like a women's rights issue. You can't become a partner and a champion on it if your own company is terrible about pay equity, or has a terrible maternity leave policy, or all these things that we know affect particularly women in the workplace. And so you might need to look first internally to things that you can change about your company before you're deciding to commit to like the League of Women Voters or all these other things, or maybe lobbying legislation to improve the pay the Little Better Act around fair pay. You might set up a system for reporting progress on this. We're going to monitor. We're going to have some KPIs, whether it's internally or externally, and then ultimately you're taking a clear position on this social issue. You're saying it really matters to that company and that you're willing to defend it. And that's the big thing, is that you're not going to take a clear position on something that you're not willing to defend to those other stakeholders who may disagree with your position on it. The last one is the champion, and I think this is for most companies should be the rarest. I don't know, if you meet, let's say 6 times a year in your social issues engagement committee, and you go through maybe 30 issues a year, you shouldn't have more than 2 to 3 where you decide to be a champion on. Most of those issues should fill probably into the supporter or partner range. The champion are for those 2 to 3 issues, or maybe potentially 1 issue if your company's just kind of dipping your toes in on this. That is a key policy issue for the company. You're actually going to commit financial and human resources, meaning you're going to say, we're going to put a lobbyist on this. We're going to commit some resources. We're going to really advocate on this issue, on this topic. You might take a leadership role in a coalition or align with other companies on this. You're going to report again on progress made. You're going to obviously keep your stakeholders, and this is where your CEO and other executives become active and visible advocates for the issue. This is where you say, this is a key priority for us. And there's some examples of that out there. And I'm going to, again, like I said, pick on Salesforce, who's done this. They've taken on 2 main issues at their company, and one is around racial equity. And so they've formed a task force around this issue. They've started partnering with associations and advocacy groups on this. They have really worked in their own organizations to change internal policies to be in alignment with this, and they've committed significant resources, both from a public policy standpoint, meaning that they're actively looking at legislation that is either for or against improving racial equality in America. They're actively judging those pieces of legislation in different states and across the U.S. They're actively committing to be a partner to organizations that are addressing this issue, and their CEO is coming out and being a visible advocate on this issue. That is very different than some of the other issues that I'm sure have come across Salesforce's desk in the last couple of years. they're doing this and they're doing another one around on climate change and sustainability. But this is where they decided to be. So they formed a task force, and these are some of the members of the task force that cuts across the entire company as well. So moving forward, where does this kind of leave us? There's a lot of work to be done. I do not, again, claim to think we have all the answers at the council, but I do think that we've come from a place that really looks at a lot of different companies, a lot of different advocacy associations, and says, who's doing kind of the best work here? What are the best practices that we can distill from that? What are the learnings that they've had? And hopefully we were able to share that today with you and create a process that I think is in line with where we should be going in the profession. One, we really need to understand that this is a new environment and expectations have changed. And I gave you some data to show that. Two, I do think every major company should have a social issues management team. And I talked about how you might form that. I do think you need to practice and research these emerging issues. You can't just say, like, we're only gonna take on the issues that come up, when they come up. You need to get good. You need to flex those muscles around how to do this. Next, I think there should be, anytime one of these issues come up, the first thing you need to do is look internally. I think when the Me Too movement happened, when the tragic murder of George Floyd happened, a lot of companies were very quick to issue statements, but they were less quick to look at the receipts and see what really their own company was doing. And they got called out by a lot of advocates and being like, yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for that pledge. Or thank you for the $1 million check or whatever it was. But you don't have a single person of color or woman on your board. Your C-suite's incredibly white and male dominated. Like that just doesn't make sense, right? Like with what your values are that you're proposing. So you really need to look at that. And it's across the board. It's not just on the social issues that are happening in the US. A lot of companies are exposed in foreign countries where they're not as far advanced and progressive as the United States is. And there are some real opportunities for groups to push companies in those areas and those countries as well. Examine how key stakeholders are interacting with the issues, determine your level of support, making a commitment and decision that fits with your level of support, and then develop and execute a communication plan and evaluates results. That's the last part that I haven't talked about yet, but all this needs to kind of be a reiterative process. You need to see if you're having impact. You need to see if your communications are getting through to your employees or to your stakeholders, and not just all communications, like I said, but it does need to be there for them. So if you have any questions about that, I have my contact is ndesarno@pac.org. I'm ndesarno on Twitter. That's my cell phone number if you want to call me. I do live in the United Kingdom, so please don't call me like after 6 p.m. It's pretty late, but you can always call me and reach me that way as well. With that, I will turn it over to Jess.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. This definitely gave me a lot to think about. So I wanted to briefly share how digital tools like Quorum can play a critical role in assisting with some of the social issue framework, in particular, helping you to communicate with the right people at the right time and driving issues with action with policymakers. See if my remote control worked. There we go. So 3 ways that we see organizations using stakeholder engagement and grassroots advocacy software to manage their social issue engagement. You can manage your stakeholder mapping and communications and engagement with grassroots campaigns. Okay, my click is being a little slow. Sorry about that. So Nick discussed in the 4th step of his playbook the importance of mapping stakeholders with categories that show how they're related to your organization. So that could include employees, customers, policymakers, advocacy groups, investors. So with a tool like Quorum, you can tag your contacts with any of those categories or multiple categories to keep your contacts really easily organized. You can also track which issue they're most interested in. So you could collect this information through existing forms related to your advocacy campaigns or customer newsletter signups, or you could assign issues based on regions where particular issues are especially prominent at a given time. And from there are a lot more ways that you can slice and dice your stakeholder mapping, including mapping which member of your team owns a personal relationship with a given stakeholder, their tier of importance to your work, lots of other things. Come on, click. There we go. You can also take your mapping a step further with stakeholder alignment tracking. So take policymakers. You may have 50 key policymakers who have a stake in your issue, but they might not agree on the same message within it. So by mapping your stakeholders by how they align to your issues, you can more easily tailor your messaging to make it really personalized. So you can share highlights of your activity for your supporters and use calls to action like voting a certain way to support your issues to try and sway detractors. The best part, I think, is that you can personalize your alignment tracking to each issue. So someone might be a supporter of your organization's stance toward voting rights, but a detractor on your position on climate change. So with a tool like Quorum's stakeholder alignment features, you can really easily make that distinction so that you can develop a more nuanced strategy there. And now that you've mapped your stakeholders, you can use those categories to send personalized communications to subsets of your stakeholders based on their interests, influence, and relationship with your team. So organizations use Quorum Outbox to send out everything from scheduling emails to make time with stakeholders to economic impact reports, company announcements, rapid response. And the list building features are really easy to use, so you can make sure your stakeholders are getting personalized messages rather than bombarding them with every message related to your social issues. So at the most basic level, you can segment messaging based on issue. So send stakeholders interested in voting rights issues messages about that. One of my favorite features that we've seen really increase engagement is that you can actually segment out and select the sender of your messages based on who on your team owns the relationship with given stakeholders. So maybe the best name to use for your email that you're sending out in order to get people to engage and open and schedule a meeting. Maybe it isn't your president, maybe it's someone who's on the ground and they already have a relationship with. So Quorum Outbox lets you send an email en masse, but the sender name will appear as the owner of that contact, and which you can set up the way we discussed in the stakeholder mapping part. And finally, you can use engagement data from those messages to evaluate your efforts. So which emails are getting the most opens, if your efforts on climate change are driving the most engagement and stakeholder communications, might be worthwhile to put more resources there. And along with their stakeholder engagement efforts, corporations are taking their existing grassroots programs that they would normally use for calls to action on their business's typical policy landscape and are now incorporating social justice issues into their action centers. So with Quorum, you can target different campaigns to different advocates. For example, if you want your employees to be able to weigh in on your supporter, partner, champion issues, but your customers to only weigh in on your champion issues, you can segment the calls to action that are available to each group. So that can address some of what we talked about there a little bit with, which is, you can segment out a little bit what you do for, if you want to do something for your employees that's a little different from what you want to do externally, there are some options there. Of course, always assume the things you do for your employees could be seen externally, but that can be one way to think about it. Within your action center, you can also embed resources to teach advocates how and why to take action. So share information on the proximity of the issue to your organization. How is it impacting a particular state, where the company is located, or where it has key facilities? And these three don't operate in silos. So after folks have taken action on grassroots campaigns, you can update your stakeholder mapping. So if someone consistently participates in every campaign, you might want to move them into a higher level of interest in your stakeholder map. Or when they register for your campaigns, you can ask questions to your forums about which issues your company weighs in on that they're most interested in, so you can narrow your communications a bit further from there. So that is the little promo Quorum section. So would love to take some questions. Let me look and see what's here. All right. So how are teams reporting on their efforts here? So how does reporting differ between internal stakeholders and external stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when we talk about how we're looking at these kind of issues, the differences, for us at least, is where are we trying to make the biggest impact in our company? Are we really like kind of similar to kind of Jorge's question about what if it's just the employees and not the customers in public? Those are really important kind of decisions to kind of go and look at and say, actually, that the metrics here is really like the media narrative. We really care about how many times our company is mentioned in next to this issue. So a lot of, let's say you want your company to be a champion around a particular issue like sustainability. You might say, how often is our company mentioned when the UN sustainability goals are mentioned, or when any of these issue topics is? So what's our share of voice? How many, and then look at our competitors, maybe similar companies or peer companies, and say, actually, they're mentioned more frequently. We need to do a better job of showing that we're a real leader and a champion on this issue. Versus some of the metrics for internal might be like, your employee satisfaction, how your town hall goes, even to like potentially your Glassdoor ratings or what's being said on Slack, can be helpful to do for internal metrics around some of these issues.
Yeah, I think the other like internal reporting we see is more just on like effectiveness of your strategy, essentially. So the kind of engagement you're getting from stakeholders to show that they're getting the content that they want and things like that, email engagement, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think Quorum has a whole host of obviously metrics there that I think is really helpful to have, and you can even track how supportive some of your key stakeholders have been over time, which I think is really, really helpful.
Yeah, those trends I think help you get a good view. So next question here, how do you think about alignment with a company's existing legislative and regulatory efforts?
Yeah, I think that's a big one. If you're engaging on a social issue and then you're lobbying in a certain state against that particular issue, that's a really bad look, right? I think one of the biggest issues for companies is that they're being called out recently as being hypocrites on some of the things that they take a stand on. And so you really need to look at that. And so I've had some really proactive companies who are going and saying, like, our consultant lobbyists, some of these large companies have like 50, 80, 100 consultant lobbyists across the globe, right? They have them in countries, they have them in every single state sometimes. They have multiple contract lobbyists in a single state, right? What's the kind of values that we want them to be talking about? What are the kind of training that we want them to receive now? So that when they go in an office, it's not just about our business issues, but they're also fully understanding the values and missions and standpoint of our company. I think that's really a great effort. It takes a lot of work. I've been a part of it on some of these cases, helping train contract lobbyists, kind of like herding cats. Sorry if there's any contract lobbyists on here. But it can be very difficult. And then looking at they're doing a real active assessment saying like, should we be with this contract lobbyist? Do they represent, are they the most diverse person in the state and represent our interests? Do they come from a political background? And are there other clients actually the opposite of where we want to be in terms of peers? So I think it is really important that you're not just legislative priorities are aligned, but how you actually do the business of government affairs is aligned as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and I think keeping that feedback loop tight so you understand both what your contract lobbyists in that case are saying and also like what your CEO has just said so they know before they walk in the door and aren't caught off guard.
Mm-hmm.
How should organizations prepare for new issues that may emerge and fall within this framework? I think that's a good question. I realized in going through this that we, like, over time and over many conversations have sort of developed certain like quorum values that we know we're going to chime in on and speak up on, but what we don't do is have that intentional time to say, like, what are the 2 to 3 things that we really want to be champions on versus other levels. So I'd love to hear how you think organizations should, like, that obviously makes a difference on what you do when new issues arise. So I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit.
I mean, I think just all organizations need to get prepared, because new issues are gonna, rise every year. Like, I'm looking at, like, what countries are holding the Olympics, because China's coming around the corner, right? Like, eventually all these countries are, and there's some real, human rights issues, right? That we're all aware of about China. So, maybe your company shouldn't be looked at, and, am I like proactively thinking about, well, who might speak out against us? What do our employees think about our involvement with the Olympics when they are in China? Or all these types of things, keep coming up. So I'm always looking at, where are there some kind of grumblings, and then the other thing, there's been a lot of controversy on political action committees as well. And when I talked about government affairs, that also is that, you cannot control with all of your, stakeholders to a member of Congress, and then they say something that is, outrageous and discriminatory or something terrible. And so you constantly just need to be providing that information, collecting it, understanding it. Kudos to Quorum. There's a lot of tools too, but like Quorum, you can pull and see what is said in press releases and transcripts and all those types of things. That's immensely helpful for when you're deciding to either continue to engage or give to a member of Congress.
Yeah, I think, news monitoring definitely makes a big difference. I think also the other thing we think about is making sure that we're ready with, like, the more clean and organized our lists and data are, the more ready we are to do that rapid response when those moments come up.
Yeah. Well,
let's see what other questions we have here. What best practices do you have for collaboration and coalition building in this area? It says working with trade associations, question mark.
Yeah, definitely a lot of trade associations have taken some of these social issues on, some of these larger environmental issues as well. Like, a big shout out to American Forest and Paper Association. They've been talking about, like, recycling. They've been talking about their ability for their products to be sustainable for a really long time before it has been, like, this green new wave. And so that association has been actually, I think, one of the organizations that have been pushing their member companies on this issue. Usually, a lot of times, it's the member companies pushing the association along. Especially in DC, we can sometimes have a lot of sleepy, quiet trade associations who are just very comfortable in doing their job, and their companies start being the kind of more aggressive, progressive on some of these issues. We've actually seen some associations take the opposite stance and say, actually, we're going to move the industry on this. We're going to be an industry mover, and we're going to push for, new metrics. We're going to push for new reporting efforts. We're going to push for new standards that we think are going to help keep our industry alive, and hopefully better their communities and the society and the environment. So I've seen several associations doing this, and sometimes it's a coalition, sometimes it's an association. And I know a lot of these kind of questions can be also really confidential and discreet and and sensitive. And so if you have any of these kind of questions, and the folks that are online, you can obviously just email me, connect with me on LinkedIn, and we can do that on a confidential basis as well.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining today, Nick. That's the last question we have. And we will talk soon. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jess. Have a great day.